Doing this presentation, which is going to be on data rescue for the environment. Brooke Andrade is our library director, and Sangeeta Desai is an intern at the National Humanities Center and has been working for us and helping us with our metadata curation, which is a huge project, and she's also a PhD in South Asian languages and literature. They are going to be talking about the data rescue work that they have been doing, which is critically important. And after the presentation, again, we'll have a chance for Q&A, and we'll bring a microphone to you.
All right, thank you, Tanya. Welcome, and thank you all for allowing us to impinge on your lunch break to talk about something that we feel is very important. Sangeeta now works in the library with me, but we collaborated 2 years ago when we co-organized a successful data rescue event here at the center. I know everyone loves a good how we met story, so I'll tell you ours as it directly relates to our discussion today. In the spring of 2017, we at the center heard about all of the environmental data rescue efforts happening across the country, and we wanted to participate, but I had no idea how to do so. A Google search revealed that an information science graduate student, Sangeeta, had already organized a very successful data rescue event at UNC. So I emailed her and asked if she would like to partner on an event focused on data for humanists here at the center. I was very upfront with her about how little I could offer beyond building space, fast internet, and snacks. And in spite of this, she graciously agreed to partner, beautifully handled all of the technical aspects and training of volunteers, and as promised, I made sure the pizzas were here on time. So that's why Sangeeta is going to tell you about the data rescue movement and our event specifically. But before we delve into that, I want to give you all some context about why humanists at a Humanities Research Institute were so concerned about environmental data and why data even needs rescuing. I understand that many of you here are environmental humanities scholars who realize that you use data in your work and understand what data looks like. But in the past, when I have talked to humanists about data, I've found that it's useful to define it for them, because many humanists are unaware of the scope of that term. I myself was unaware until 5 years ago when I attended a digital humanities workshop targeted at literary scholars. My background is in literature. I took as few math and science courses as possible, and for a long time I thought all data looked like this. There are numbers in columns with labels I don't understand, and then you do math on them, and that was very intimidating to me. And yes, that is data. But data isn't just numeric, and it isn't just in columns and rows. In fact, one of the best definitions of data I've seen is from the NEH. So as you can see, they include citations, digital tools, documentation, databases, reports, and articles. And we use those. The research materials humanists use are on my desk and on my computer screen every day. And really, the only items I haven't worked with in this list are algorithms and software codes. And fellows, please do not take this as a challenge to request them. So, knowing this, we now understand this is data. This is an early citizen science project, handwritten weather reports mailed to the Smithsonian by regular people around the United States. And they didn't just turn in charts. They also turned in hand-drawn maps and even insects as artifacts of weather events. Most of the data I work with here looks a lot more like this than those charts and tables. But going back to hosting a data rescue event at the National Humanities Center, we weren't photographing crumbling manuscripts that day, even though that is very important. We were mostly saving those data sets and columns and rows. So what do humanists do with that? Humanists take environmental data, everything from 19th century rainfall maps to NOAA data sets, and they tell stories with it. And those stories help people understand the implications of climate degradation. Humanists use historical climate data to create projects that are accessible and compelling to both scholars and the public. When we tell the story of how, at least in part, climate change allowed Genghis Khan to launch the Mongol invasions, which resulted in the deaths of millions of people, or how the plague pandemic might have been driven more by climate change than by rats, we are using temperature data from centuries ago to show how dramatically climate change can shift the course of humanity. So one message from these projects is that climate change kills, regardless of the time period. We also use climate data to support environmental justice efforts, to tell stories of how climate change disproportionately affects those most vulnerable. And we use climate data to raise awareness through art. On the left are tempestries, which are weavings in which each color represents a temperature. And on the right, an evidence-based projection of sea level rise in Philadelphia in a beautiful drawing. So, columns and rows cannot tell a story, and data alone cannot demonstrate its own value. Scientists can analyze and draw conclusions based on data, but many of them lack the ability to communicate it and make it relevant to non-scientists, and humanists do that work. Now, most of you remember alarming news items like this, which started popping up regularly in early 2017. And that was the moment many people previously unaware of the vulnerability of data became aware. And it's the reason communities scrambled to organize data rescue events, like the one we held here. But before we get to that, I want to point out that this isn't a new problem, and most data loss is not politically motivated. We know losing data has been a concern as long as there was data. For example, back in 1985, there was a report on the problem of putting government data on disks without redundancy. Somebody already knew that those formats would one day be obsolete. So most data loss is not political, and most of it is not pulling down links or taking down websites. It's the equivalent of putting your thumb drive in your jeans pocket and forgetting to take it out when you wash them, or putting your child's birth certificate in a very safe place you can't remember. Those are just random examples and not anything that happened to me. Data loss is often a result of unstable formats. Paper is actually more stable than any of those disks that we see here. How many of you have floppy disks or hopefully not cassette tapes, but disks that you now cannot use because you don't have the hardware to read them? We also have a problem with the file formats. So I don't know if you ever used Corel anything, but those files are very difficult to read, and Corel Quattro Pro for DOS was a spreadsheet program, and it would take a specialist to be able to get the data from those files. So, right. Digital documents last forever, or 5 years, whichever comes first, because most formats become obsolete in 5 years. So why do we need to rescue data then? So many reasons. One, which we've probably all experienced, is that it becomes buried. So either a link is taken down or it's moved and nobody bothers to update it on the website, or something is buried in an archive without a finding aid. So you know it's in those boxes, but you have no idea where. Sometimes it gets thrown away, sometimes on purpose because it's about endangered species, sometimes accidental because they don't recognize the value of the data. Sometimes data is behind a paywall, and sometimes it's behind a paywall even though you already paid for it with your taxes. And sometimes the organization hosting the data closes up shop, at least temporarily, which means that during a federal shutdown, you still cannot access that data until the government boots back up. And sometimes data stops being collected, even though it's very valuable. And that happens most often because the organization collecting the data doesn't understand its value. Or it's because they know its value, but they don't actually want that data to be out there. So back to this, 2017, I'm going to hand it over to Sangeeta to talk about how we used this moment to start rescuing data here.
As Brooke demonstrated so well, there's a lot of threats to data beyond political reasons. However, what was interesting about 2016, 2017 was that this was probably the most visible threat to the general public. And it's, maybe for lack of a better way to say it, kind of the sexiest reason. It was the most galvanizing reason to get people out there, people who, much more than obviously data obsolescence or data rot or that kind of thing. No one really wants to hear about that, and many people don't know about that. However, something like this was, created a lot of, it was a visible threat that really galvanized people, and for those of us who are working with the data, and those of us who are, whether you're working with the data or as an information professional seeking to curate this data, what was the most immediate, it became one of the most immediate threats. And certainly for me, it was the immediacy of the threat that made me act and moved me to take action back in January 2017. As a master's student at that time, I was already involved in a few campus net neutrality campaigns, and in looking for more information about those campaigns, I came across a fundraiser for the A2 data rescue happening in University of Michigan to be held at Ann Arbor. They were selling these wonderful tote bags to raise money for the event, to host this one-day hackathon event where they were going to scrape environmental and climate change data before it disappeared. So I immediately contacted the fundraisers to find out more about the movement and how I might organize a local data rescue here. After all, I was a member of one of the greater I schools in the country. I also wanted a handbag. At the time, Justin Schell, a University of Michigan librarian who is helping to organize the A2 data rescue, he contacted me back and gave me more information about the larger Data Refuge movement and a link to attend a webinar sponsored by the Data Refuge organization. And in fact, Bethany Wiggins over there could probably speak much more about Data Refuge, as she was a key speaker at that webinar. And because the Data Refuge movement, as I soon learned in the webinar, in anticipation of these looming political threats to climate change and environmental government data, the Data Refuge movement began as a collaboration between the University of Pennsylvania's Program in Environmental Humanities, the Environmental Data Governance Initiative over at the University of Toronto, and the Internet Archive's end-of-term project in 2016. So EDGI had previous experience with guerrilla archiving under the Harper administration. And the Internet Archive's end-of-term project, which began in 2008, was a collaboration amongst the International Internet Preservation Consortium, the National Digital Infrastructure and Preservation Program, to archive U.S. federal government websites at the end of the Bush administration. And they've continued to do that with every 4 years, at the end of every presidential term. So one of the initial goals of the Data Refuge movement, as you can see up there, was to try to identify, assess, prioritize, and and scrape and save as much data they could from these federal climate change and environmental websites. And they wanted to create reliable copies. So in other words, they were essentially trying to generate a backup of this information. There's more to it than that, but that's the gist of it. And they were racing against incredible odds with the time frame, the immediate threat. So what is a data rescue? So the data rescue events were essentially, while Data Refuge is a larger national grassroots collaborative movement, individual data rescue events served as the local components of Data Refuge. Data rescue events were kind of where all the volunteers in a local level gathered together in order to scrape the data, identify the data, and also it served also as a great platform for just raising more awareness about the issues. And so as the events were mainly organized and led by local participants, Data Refuge provided pre-event training, workflows, guides, and as well as some remote assistance during the events. Though Data Refuge initially assigned each event particular federal information sites, which I'll talk a little bit about more later, they would kind of monitor who was crawling what in order to make sure we didn't duplicate efforts among the different data rescues. And there have been about 50 data rescues since they started this in December 2016. Although now I think they've got this automated now. So at that point, having learned more about data rescue and data refuge, I began to organize Data Rescue Chapel Hill. So Data Rescue Chapel Hill was a one-day event from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The UNC libraries provided a lot of the logistical support and the venue through the research hub of Davis Library. We provided pizza and coffee thanks to funding from the School of Information and Library Science. And participants were asked to bring laptops if they could. However, thankfully, the research hub also provided computers there as well for volunteers. So we were able to welcome volunteers from all backgrounds and technical abilities. I think one of the wonderful things about the way Data Rescue is organized is that it allows anyone to participate, whatever your archival skills are, whatever your technical skills are. You just have to care and want to be there. And so we used the workflow developed by EDGI and the Data Refuge Project. And our goal was to scrape federal climate change and environmental data, but we also were looking for a way to get some HUD data in there as well, because one of our prominent graduate students who's been an active member in all this, Michelle Padley, specifically worried that her research was, she's in the Department of Geography, and her work is like feminist geography, and she relies on HUD data. So she was very worried about that, and she came in to help us. And she was, she was kind of one of the few data users at the event, surprisingly enough for us. Most of the people that were there, as you can see, were graduate students, there were professors, undergrads, a lot of environmental activists, and some IT professionals. So a lot of people who understood about data and cared about data, but very few people who were actually using the data sets that we were working with. So just a little about what happens at a data rescue. So this workflow has been retired since May 2017, but this is what we used when we worked on it. And so these are the different teams. There's a primer writing group, the seeding and sorting, which is the web archiving. There's the data rescue team, which I'll talk a little bit more about, the long trail, and event organization and coordination. So some of these names are dated, but basically the primer writing group, so there's this whole aspect about this. In order to find the information, what Data Refuge had done was made these agency primers. So each agency and even sub-agencies dealing with climate change data created these primers, and they would hand them out to the different data rescues so that we could find the information and the links, and then that's how you would feed information into the workflow. And because we wanted to get some HUD data, we started what was called a primer writing group. So I think we were maybe one of the first to do that at an event, and we had a group that was just focusing on how to write a HUD agency primer so that we could try to get that flowing into the data rescue movement. And then once the primer goes in, it goes into the seeding and sorting. And so we have a team there where the team leader, so all of these groups, I should mention, has a team leader who was trained ahead of time. Volunteers that came together, we organized, and they were trained using a lot of the work from Data Refuge. And the team leader for seeding and sorting would teach volunteers, and this is one of the skills for the people who didn't have great technical skills, very little experience. This was seeding and sorting was very easy. You came on the computer. There's a extra browser link from the end of term archives that Internet Archives provided, and they would go through the list of links they were given from the agency and begin to nominate the web pages. And then they would go through each link and click on that and find if there were more links. And in this way, they could nominate websites to be archived in the Internet Archive. However, there would always be moments where all this information cannot be crawled by the Internet Archive, and that's one of the big problems. There's data sets and other kind of complicated information. So when they come across that information, that's where the sorting part comes in. Then they send it over to the data rescue team. I'll talk about that in a second. The long trail was another really important aspect of this. It was called the long trail, but really it's more like documenting and storytelling at the event, trying to put more of the human face on the event. And then that was a great place also for people who were maybe not technically savvy, but still wanted to contribute. And then we also allowed people to help with event organization and coordination. So there was always a place for somebody who wanted to come and help. So looking a little bit more at data, I'm not going to get too technical here, but this was kind of the workflow, just to give you a sense of, sometimes we take all this data, maybe some of you do or maybe some of you don't, take the data, there's a lot that has to go through data curation. And so, again, I'm still astonished at how well the data rescue moved, because this workflow, the work that had to be done in order to ensure that this data that was copied remains reliable, meant it had to go through this. So this was the data rescue team. So we followed, again, this workflow was developed by EDGI and Data Refuge. But you can see there's the researchers, harvesters, checkers, baggers. So the information is going through each of those roles. And the researchers basically check if the information that was sent from the seeders and sorters, does it really need to, can it really not be taken in by the Internet Archive? They double check it, they research it, and if they say it needs to go on, it goes on to the harvesters. And then from there, the harvesters are going to see how to crawl the information, goes to checkers, they verify and make sure it's complete. And then, because you have to have the complete data set. And then, of course, baggers do the quality assurance, and describers, which was probably one of the hardest things, especially when you don't have data users coming. We needed the metadata. So metadata. We needed that for our data, so people can describe not only what the set is, but how do you use it so it can be usable in the future. So the results of Data Rescue Chapel Hill, I think we did save some data, some data sets. We didn't really save any HUD data, but we did manage to save some Department of Energy data. But for me, what I had learned too, we generated quite a bit of public awareness about data. And of course, we talked about the political urgency of this, but it was a great chance and a great opportunity to discuss the regular threats to data and why people are using this data and the importance of the data, as well as issues regarding open access, public rights to information, and again, digital preservation basics back it up. It also was an important opportunity to act, especially at that time people were still feeling really raw from the election results. And I myself was really happy for this as a concrete way to do something to fight some of the administration changes taking place. But I also had many volunteers come up to me, thanking me in their own ways, saying yeah, this was really good for me to do this. I was really happy to have this chance to do something I can see my efforts going into. And lastly, community. From this, the team leaders and I and a couple other people who really enjoyed this really wanted to have another event. And we ended up calling our organization Data Rescue Chapel Hill. So the event turned into a group. And fortunately then, our group had a chance to do something because Brooke called and let us know that the National Humanities Center was very interested in partnering up to organize another data rescue event. But this time, we wanted to focus more on the humanities. We were interested in HUD data, Health and Human Services, as well as Department of Education. So we ended up having our, we started planning since basically end of March, and we had done a couple things differently. Aside from the different choices of what kind of information we were focusing on, it was a 2-day event, 10 to 2, and we tried to include a couple other things this time, because one of the things that Data Refuge did so well also was to just tell everyone who's having a data rescue event, please make the event your own. You know, do what you can and try to reach out to your community. So this time we had more time to plan and learn from things. So one of the things we did was write a survey using some, I used a template off of what Data Refuge have to ask the community, like, what kind of data sets do you use? What's important to you? Why do you think it's endangered? And so we had written up a survey and sent it out. Thanks to the National Humanities Center, had sent it out to so many of the local universities, think tanks, research institutions. And we really didn't, again, get any response to that. So again, this is an issue that we really need to think about. Data users really need to speak up and advocate for your data. So that, we didn't really get any response from that, so that didn't really guide anything we did. We also had a primer writing event, because again, we wanted to put in HUD data, other kind of things. So Data Refuge's agency primers, for the most part, are focused on environmental and climate change data. So we wanted to add some HUD primers, Department of Education and Health and Human Services one. So we thought we'd have a primer writing event ahead of time, so we'd actually have primers to use at the event itself. But also it was a chance to, some people were really, really excited about writing primers, and so we got that going. We had some stubs that could also continue during the event. And it was a really successful event, given that we're, you know, it took place right here in this beautiful room, and we had about 30 volunteers each day. And it was kind of a different makeup because it was the summer, so we had a lot less students, actually. And we had retirees and IT professionals, as well as like some librarians. But again, very few data users. Sorry. So the outcomes were basically that we were able to save some HUD data. We generated public awareness, and it was exciting because it was to a whole new public. There were a lot more retirees and concerned citizens, and they were really fun to work with. Again, an opportunity to act. The two things that were really great about this particular data rescue, I thought, again, was we were able to add HUD primers. Even though they were retiring the workflow, it was still great to have a little bit more work towards the HUD agency data. And we focused a lot more on storytelling. So Data Refuge itself at this point was moving, they were expanding their scope and really moving more towards emphasizing more storytelling versus scraping the data. Because without that human side, as we're all talking about and learning, some of this data just really doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't mean anything to the public. They can't really connect with it without that human side. So we were really great. We were really good at like focusing on the storytelling this time, and we had Esco, who did our storytelling. He was awesome. That's what I was trying to say. He got, we had about like 17 stories at the end of the 2 days that we were able to send to Data Refuge. And so, again, just to kind of wrap up this segment, talking about the importance of the storytelling, even in our smaller, in the micro level, even with our data rescue events, we were realizing how much more building the awareness and the storytelling to our community was than scraping the data. I mean, that was important too, but that storytelling aspect became really out in the forefront. And of course, the larger Data Refuge organization was doing the same. And so then just to kind of reiterate, there's a couple events that now are in place, like Endangered Data Week, which Data Refuge is also partnering with the Digital Library Federation and Mozilla Science Lab, National Digital Stewardship Alliance, to promote an Endangered Data Week. And that happened actually February 25th to March 1st. It already passed. But that's a great opportunity for academic institutions, research institutions to kind of promote endangered data. What does it mean? What can we do to preserve it? And to just try to get the communities actually interacting with it and understanding the importance of it. There's also Open International Access Week, which I think has been happening for like 10 years now. And this is just another movement where it's talking about promoting open access to resources. And then the Sunshine Week, which has also been going on for quite a few years, and that is talking about your public access to federal information and your rights. So I'm just going to pass it on to Brooke, who has a couple more suggestions for how you can save endangered data.
Right, very quickly, because we are committed to letting you have a break. So we do want to encourage you that if you produce data, to make it open, available, and discoverable. So there are many things that you can do. First of all, you can nominate websites for web archiving with the Wayback Machine, and there's actually a Chrome extension for that, so it just takes a click. You can participate in citizen science projects, which are fun and often you can do from your sofa by transcribing old weather records, and there are multiple types, different subjects for that. Please tell your data story. Please talk about the data you use, because if you don't talk about it, it could get thrown away or it could just stop being collected. I think that sometimes is invisible in humanist work in particular. Finally, make sure that you back up. So don't put stuff on your thumb drive so it gets washed. Use descriptive file names so that people in the future can figure out what that file is. Apply metadata. I've heard metadata described as a love note to future researchers. So they can use your data. Stable file formats. So non-proprietary file formats, CSV, PDFA, XML. Track versions of your data, so save files when you make significant changes and keep them. And finally, make it open, accessible, and free, and not just behind a paywall. And there are several ways you can do this. Most of you have institutional repositories if you're at a university, and there's also the Open Science Framework. So please feel free to come up and talk to us at some point in the afternoon. If you're interested in participating in data rescue, we can send you links and make suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you both for this fascinating presentation, also for doing this work that's so important for teaching us how to think about stuff that's often invisible, but that's so vital. We are going to take some time for some questions, and I just wanted to assure you all that we actually built in an extra 15 minutes into the last panel. So we're going to start that 15 minutes later. So the wrap-up panel is going to start at 1:45, and then we still have an hour and 15. But we will have a break, so we'd love to get some questions.
I just want to thank you guys so much for the work that you've been doing. It's really super inspiring to see. As you mentioned, in Philly, we did a lot to try to help organize things, and we never knew like how if they were going to work or not. But even just seeing like prose that I wrote of instructions up on the screen was like amazingly heartening. And I just wanted to make a plug for one other way that people can get involved, and I'm like beyond thrilled. And of course, it's not surprising to me that you here at the National Humanities Center have understood the vitality of the long trail and the storytelling projects. We have a collaborative grant now from the National Geographic Foundation to carry on some of that work. And it will remain as public and open and collaborative as we can possibly make it. We're getting off the ground now, seeding a story bank. So, the narrative counterpart to a data bank, and it is a global map, and we invite people to submit stories that are then geotagged to locations. So you can just access it via datarefuge.org, and it says Data Story Bank. And that will be rolling out over the next couple of months. We have different teams across the country who will work with us much more intensively, but we also want to make it as open to individuals and as many communities as possible. So thank you.
Well, and thank you. We were both thrilled and terrified that Bethany was in the audience because she started all of this, and if you use some environmental data sets, you can directly thank Bethany for really starting this movement. So you are responsible for so much good work. All right. Oh.
So, yes, thanks. And Brooke, as somebody, and Sangeeta, as somebody who probably didn't respond to your survey, or did so inappropriately, I appreciate the effort you made. The two of you brought up a really important point along the way in your discussion, which is that it was the creation of stories from the data that really struck me as a huge contribution, in addition, of course, to the effort to save material. And so I guess where I'm coming from here is this like the Joni Mitchell line, you know, you don't know what you've got till it's gone? Is it that we're awash in data and that we just take it for granted, but that we also, most of us, many of us, don't actually know what that data is doing or what it might do? And it sounds like that was part of what you were doing, was describing what the data does and how it might be of use. Can you talk more about an example, one example, for example?
Well, sure, I'd add the caveat that not if you're a librarian.
We've always known, by the way.
But, so I'm not sure if this is exactly answering your question, but I think that, well, Michelle Padley, for example, the graduate student I was referencing, was a really great example. She was very active in the movement. She wanted to save HUD data. She works in geography. She does geography of politics, geography of feminism, that type of work, and she relies on HUD data. Like literally, as we were working on the second Data Refuge, we were at the primer writing event, and she looked online and said, they just pulled down my data set that I use, one of the data sets that I use.
On low-income housing.
Right, thank you, yeah.
Yeah.
And so she was just freaking out. And it came back, mysteriously came back online a couple days later. And the truth is, we don't know if it's like, you know, just human error or if this was a political move, like whatever happened. But for her, it was startling. And it was really interesting to see the transformation with Michelle because she was just trying to do her research. And because she became so active in this movement, she really started to understand, like, wow, the fragility of my data, you know, the fact that I can't find it. And as one of the things she relayed to me that was so interesting and very educational for me was she was talking about how she was trying to galvanize other students in her department. And she was like, why aren't you coming out? And like, oh, well, if it's lost on the federal side, it's okay because these private companies have it, you know, and they have better. And a lot of times, you know, we understand, you know, the user interfaces are far better on some of these private sites. However, you're going to get charged for that. And once it's off the, you know, the federal, once it's not open access and free, who knows what they're going to charge you for that. And also, you know, there's something to be said about when it is on a federal website. You know, the data reusability is always an issue. Can we guarantee the validity, the trustworthiness of this data? So what Michelle was finding and what she relayed to me was that, wow, you know, so many researchers and scholars think because they're getting it from another place, like it just doesn't matter. And half of them, she said, didn't even realize that that data was coming from a government website because it was just like so gussied up in this private website, you know, this new interface, that they didn't realize that, you know, once the government website goes down, that data is still going to be lost. So those are also really some interesting aspects of this.
Jay is my data user this year.
I am your data user, and I thank you very much for everything you've done. I want to, my mapping site for federal payments to counties has relied extensively on HathiTrust and Internet Archive for a lot of government-published documents that just go away. And what I want to say is have two observations. One is that, you know, data doesn't speak for itself, and thus having the reports that it goes along with are equally important oftentimes for this stuff. But also having been in Canada when the Department of Fisheries and Oceans just completely divested 7 of its 11 libraries, the report itself is also in a context. And as we lose those contexts of not simply what the data itself is embedded in, but what the reports are embedded in, both of those are really critical losses. And I just wonder if there's any way of, scanning goes a long ways towards things, but the context of documents too. And I just wonder how you could ever possibly even rebuild that.
So at our events, the work that I did, because I don't understand data sets or JSON files, we scraped the context. So we saved the PDF files, we saved the text that gave context to the data, because it is just as important, and I think especially for humanists, because you sometimes are relying on the interpretation of that evidence instead of just reading the evidence alone. And I'll say that I was in library school when the government printing office stopped printing everything in print and sending it out to university libraries. And so we don't know what's missing. You can pull down a catalog record, you can pull down a file, and it essentially never existed. So there's a lot to be said for saving your own copies, even in paper. Paper is a more stable format than digital a lot of the time. Oh, I love the amens happening in the audience here.
If I could just add to what you're saying, the other aspect of this is metadata. And so one of the real challenges also with this, in general with archiving, but also with this, was that metadata is best when the producer, the data producer, adds the metadata and says, this is what I did, this is, there's a whole thing of like what we need from you about describing the data, when it was collected, not just that type of thing, but saying what you can use this for or how it was used, just giving as much description as possible. So it's great if you can get it ahead of time. But in this case, in this situation, for example, we just do the best we can, like scraping it off the website, as Brooke just explained. But this is where we were hoping that data users would come. And this was the one thing that was like very disappointing for us, was not having the data users there to say, hey, this is how I use this. This is what you can do. Because trying to bring metadata back after the fact is always difficult, but especially if you don't have anyone there to explain why it's being used.
We didn't get a single result for that survey. So we sent it out to nonprofits, we sent it out to academic institutions, we sent it out to all kinds of people, and we did not get anyone saying, oh, I use this in particular and I'm worried about it going away. Shame on, I'm sorry, Matthew. You didn't get my email? Did you send me an email? I don't believe you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just have a quick question about trust and trustworthiness. I know you mentioned it a few times, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what trust means for these processes, either during the actual rescue of the data or in the organizing of these refuge events.
Okay. Yeah, so when we say trustworthy in archives, in archival sciences, that's a very specific weight to it. And what we're talking about in a very basic way is ensuring the provenance, ensuring the chain of custody. So we want to show, as the data is moved from place to place, saved every time, was it tampered with? And so there are ways to do that. You have to have checksums, what we call checksums, and it's basically an algorithm that shows, it's a way of showing that the data is exactly the same each time, but you need to show, as it moves from computer to computer, from place to place, that the data hasn't been tampered with. So that's one way. With physical objects, there's other ways that they prove provenance and chain of custody. So that's one of the issues with data reusability in general and with data curation, is to ensure that trustworthiness of the data. And for data reusability, if without proof of that, it's very difficult for scientists to use the data, because then suddenly their entire work can be impugned if someone says, you can't show me that the data wasn't changed or something. And so that's one of the things with data rescue that was a very difficult thing to do, but I think they had a workflow that tried to account for that and tried to show a way of matching things. One thing I want to say about Data Refuge is that it did really well with the time frame and the massive amount of information and the fact that it was such a volunteer effort. I think, I'm still amazed at how well they were able to scrape the data. And right now it's, well, I don't want to speak too much for it because Bethany's here, so I don't. But I think that, yeah, there are some issues perhaps to look into in terms of trustworthiness, but I think that they already are working on some solutions for that. And there were things in the workflow that were providing for that.
Thank you again, Bethany.
Yeah.
And perfect segue. Please join me in thanking Brooke Andrade and Sangeeta Desai for their presentation.